The reading that I have now is from Ody Saunters' Out of Time. It takes place in 1783 in Old Salem, while Ody is caught there in a time-traveling accident. He does meet some friends along the way, and one of them is Clayton Robins, a former soldier who is staying in Salem to catch up with an old sweetheart of his. Their romance happens over several chapters, an episode at a time, so I've put a few of those together for you to help you understand the romance of Clayton and Nancy McClure. Ody learns a secret from his roommate, Clayton Robins. He remains in Salem to find a lost sweetheart, but Salem likes to keep boys and girls separated. The girls wear colored ribbons indicating their age and marital status, and the elders must approve every marriage. In this passage, Ody first hears about Clayton's love for Nancy McClure. Robin stirred the fire and then sat in Newman's chair. He leaned forward to whisper, "'Tis a girl who keeps me here." "A girl?" I asked, raising my voice. Tilt turned his head toward us, and the bed frame squeaked in Newman's room. When the sleepers settled, I whispered, "This is the worst place in the world to find a girl." "Not just any girl, the only girl." He stared at his boots and muttered, "You're too young to have been in love, I guess." Charity Lark. How long had it been since I thought of her? "I've loved," I said. "Well, then you know." I nodded and helped Clay with his task of staring at the warm glow on the floor as he told his story. There was a girl, Nancy McClure. She and her mother worked for a farmer who lived near Nancy's aunt in my village. She was my first sweetheart. When she was old enough, I courted her, but her mother took to the Moravian way. She arranged for her daughter to work in Salem where she'd get an education, far from me. I asked to work here too, but Salem town disagreed. Now that the war is over, I must find Nancy. Clay twisted the rim of his hat in his lap. She might be married by now. "Didn't the Moravian boys go to war same as you?" I asked. "No, most did not. The brethren are pacifists, and they paid extra tax to keep from fighting. And you chose war?" I could have joined another congregation and gotten a certificate to stay home, but I had no reason to stay without her. I was only fit for fighting, at least I thought so then. "Well, how will you find her?" "I do not know, but I want to stay till I do." Well, in the next day or so, they find Nancy. And Clayton is trying to persuade Ody to help him meet with her. He needs to find out if she still wants him. "I must see her. Her ribbon is pink. That means she is of age to marry. They will choose a husband for her soon." "Can't you ask for her hand?" Robins looked at his shoes, and then his head fell to the fists clasped on his knees. He shook his head slowly and spoke to the floor. "They will give her to someone in the congregation. I don't belong. They will not allow her to marry me." "Well, what if she chooses you instead of the congregation?" He shook his head faster. "She will not." "How can you know that before you ask her?" Clay raised his head, eyes drooping and brow furrowed, staring at the air in front of his face. "Doesn't she love you back?" "She did once," he replied. "She was a shy lass, but we were friends, close friends. I called her my first sweetheart, but I was weak enough to look back when other girls looked my way. She loved only me, but she did not trust me to be true. Without trust, her love faded." "You've come back for her. That must count for something." "Maybe, unless her heart belongs to another now." Clayton stood before me, eyes pleading. "You must help me. You know where she is. Go to her. No one is here to stop you." A conch shell trumpet sounded. Clayton Robins shook his head and pointed toward the watchman's blaring horn. "He will stop me." Now, in this next passage, Ody finds a way to sneak to the potter's shop where Nancy is living, and he's going to bring a message from Clayton. This is Ody speaking. I returned to my cot and spent hours listening to the baying of the night watchman's trumpet. Near the hut, on to the tavern, followed by a distant blast from his root's end. The notes grew louder as Nissen returned around the square and toward God's acre. I knew where Nissen was and where he was not. That and the timing of his rounds was useful information. I waited by the hut door as Nissen passed me on his way toward the tavern, and then I slipped into the garden and made my way among bushes and trees until I found the potter's kiln. The eastern sky grew brighter, but multitudes of stars still twinkled. The yard turned yellow in the light of an opening door, and a tiny young woman emerged. She was up to feed the chickens. I waited for her in the shadows of the potter's work table. Would she scream at the sight of me? I huddled small and low with my head bowed. "Shh, miss, please, can you spare a few kernels of corn for the hungry?" She gasped, and one side of the feed bowl slipped from her hands. I caught the rim and held it up for her to take as I kneeled with my head lowered. "What are you doing here?" she asked as she took the feed from me. "I seek a Miss Nancy McClure," I whispered, eyes still cast to the ground. "I am Nancy that was," she replied. "When the brethren baptized me, they named me Naomi. How do you know me?" "Miss Naomi, I bring a message from Clayton Robins. He longs to see you." "Clay, I no longer think of Mr. Clayton Robins," she said. "He's long gone from here, no doubt with blood and the scent of a woman's perfume on his hands. A husband, a good moral man of the brethren, will be chosen for me soon. You may tell that to Mr. Robins." "And if he has a reply?" I raised my eyes to hers. She gasped as she looked behind her, her neck red and splotchy. Tiny fingers clutched the edge of her bowl, and she bit her lip as she turned back to me. "He will do best for us both to never reply." I looked into narrowed eyes and asked, "But if he does?" She hesitated with shallow breath, and then she whispered, "I feed the chickens every morning, and I draw water from the standpipe before I leave for school. If Clayton must speak to me—" She looked around the yard before continuing, "There are loose stones behind the kiln. Hide any message you bring under those stones." She clutched her feet in one hand and drew her shawl around her with the other. With head held high, she said, "You may tell Mr. Robins that I've learned to read since he left for the war." "I will tell him, Miss McClure. He will be grateful for any chance you give him." The house door opened wider. "Naomi?" a female voice called. The girl turned to the door, and behind the pink ribbon of her bonnet, light shone on a palm-sized strawberry mark spilling over her jaw and neck. She turned back to me and whispered, "Tell him I'm satisfied here and that I will soon marry." The sky was dawning when Naomi left me. I kept to the shadows, dodging the sound of Nissen's conch trumpet. Shadows grew lighter as the sun crept toward the horizon. While my vest and pants blended in with the trees, the socks and shirt sleeves were easier to see. I wished for my grandmother's gray cloak to hide me as I made my way to the hut. And in this final episode tonight, Clayton goes himself to meet with Nancy. When we returned to the potter's lot, I was the one hiding in the woods, and Robins knelt by the work table when Naomi came outside to feed the chickens. I couldn't hear what was said, but the girl acted nervous and reluctant to speak with him. Robins took the feed bowl from her and pulled her to kneel beside him. With both her hands in his, he spoke rapidly while his eyes locked to hers. Despite my best intention to give them privacy, I worked my way through the shadows to stand closer. She shook her head, and he pulled her closer to him as he made his case. He put one fist to his heart and said, "I've changed. The war changed me." And then he touched the strawberry mark on her neck. She pulled back, and he stopped talking long enough to kiss his fingers and touch the mark gently. "I love you. No matter where I was in the war, the way to you was the way home. You are my home. You are my treasure." She caught her breath and then said, "This is my home." "Then I'll make it my home too," he whispered. "The brethren may not let you stay, and if they find me with you, they won't let me stay either." "I will convince them." For a moment they knelt facing each other, and I thought they would kiss. She lowered her eyes and shook her head. They have a husband in mind for me. They have a man in mind for you who needs a woman to wed. I need you, Nancy McClure. Naomi, she muttered, head still lowered. I am Naomi now, and I wish to stay Naomi. And I love you, Naomi. I will be the husband you need. God will decide, she whispered. The lot. God knows what is best. God will decide on me then, Clayton said. He knows my heart. She looked into his eyes. If the brethren allow you to stay, if God chooses you, then so shall I. Her lips turned up, reflecting his smile. A rooster crowed, and Naomi stood to feed her hens. Leave it to me, Clayton said. I'll leave it to God, she replied, but the smile spread over her face and lit a fire in her eyes. That fire brightened Clayton's path to our hut. I'll stay in Salem, he said, as we entered the mixed yard. When he wakens, I'll ask Newman to vouch for me. What is the lot? I asked. If the brethren approve of me, and if Naomi tells them she's agreeable to marrying me, they'll ask God if it's right. That is the lot. The elders write yes, no, and pray more on 3 slips of paper. Then they tuck each slip into a hollow reed. After prayers, one of the council members selects a reed, and they take what is written in the reed to be God's will. 'Twas the lot that banned me from living in Salem before the war. This time the lot will be good for me. How do you know that? I asked, eyes wide. Because God is good, and now I am good too. I nodded, but it was still hard for me to imagine choosing a wife by drawing straws.